Opening the central diagonal instantly stakes a claim for space and prepares for swift piece development towards the heart of the board. Sicilians unleash immediate central counterplay, rejecting a symmetric struggle. Initiating development toward the center, this knight leap immediately prepares for d4, seizing central space and asserting influence. Securing the central pawn with d6 immediately challenges white's knight's influence, setting the stage for a dynamic Sicilian defense. Challenging the center, d4 immediately creates pawn tension and opens lines for piece development, a fundamental principle in this Sicilian defense. This capture immediately opens the center, creating tactical possibilities and demanding careful piece development from both sides. Opening the central files for rapid piece development, the knight boldly occupies the ideal outpost, dictating play. Developing the knight to f6 challenges the central pawn and prepares castling, a sensible step in this open Sicilian. Fortifying the central pawn and preparing kingside development, this standard response in the Sicilian sets a firm foundation for white's positional ambitions. Embracing the Sicilian dragon setup, black aims to fianchetto the bishop, creating a formidable diagonal battery targeting white's queenside. Gaining central influence, this piece aims to bolster the d4 pawn and prepare for kingside castling, while also eyeing the diagonal that often becomes a battlefield in this Sicilian setup. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies the fianchetto, giving it a commanding diagonal across the board and preparing to castle kingside, a natural and harmonious continuation in this Sicilian setup. Solidifying the central pawn chain, this maneuver prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm or reinforces the knight's position, while simultaneously limiting the scope of black's fianchettoed bishop and creating a slight weakness on the e3-g5 diagonal that may be exploitable later. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move simultaneously bolsters the pawn chain and prepares to contest the central files, a crucial element in the ensuing Sicilian structure. Unifying the queen with the kingside castling plan creates a formidable battery on the d-file, simultaneously pressuring c5 and preparing for a potential pawn storm later, while also reinforcing the central pawn structure for future action. Safeguarding the king now allows for development and preparation of counterplay, a wise decision given white's central pawn presence. Shifting the bishop to the diagonal opens up aggressive possibilities, eyeing weaknesses around black's castled king and preparing for potential pawn pushes that expand white's central influence. Strategically repositioning the knight to d7 initiates a subtle knight maneuver, aiming to bolster the kingside defense while potentially eyeing squares like c5 or b6 for future queenside play. This knight's departure from c6, though seemingly passive, clears the path for a pawn push or a more dynamic development of other pieces. It's a quiet, preparatory maneuver building towards future complexities. Castling queenside dramatically opens the d-file and immediately targets black's kingside, creating an imbalance that will likely lead to sharp play. White now prepares to launch a pawn storm on the kingside, while black will likely aim for counterplay on the queenside or down the central files. The early queenside castling signifies an aggressive intention to exploit the open d-file and potential king exposure. Diverting the knight from its initial central posting sets the stage for a thematic pawn break, aiming to disrupt white's queenside initiative and potentially unlock lines for its own pieces. Relocating the bishop to the rim from the active central square frees up the d2 square for a rook, preparing for a potential queenside pawn storm or a more aggressive maneuvering game, while also subtly keeping an eye on the a4 square should black attempt to advance their queenside pawns. The knight embarks on a daring sortie, aiming to exchange white's influential bishop and disrupt the queenside pawn structure. Shifting the queen to d3 aims to bolster the central pawns and prepare for potential kingside advances, while also creating an escape square for the king should it be threatened on the queenside. Shifting the bishop to d7 aims to connect the rooks and prepare for pawn advances on the queenside, while also offering a potential rerouting to c8 or even b7 if the queenside opens up. A bold territorial advance, white immediately seeks to seize kingside space, aiming to pry open lines against black's castled position and potentially launch a pawn storm. But this aggressive intent also creates a long-term pawn skeleton that could become a weakness if black can successfully counterattack on the queen side or in the center. Black reroutes their rook to the open half-open, file, asserting presence and eyeing potential battery formations along that diagonal, simultaneously preparing to contest control of critical squares and potentially initiating counterplay against white's kingside if the opportunity arises. Unleashing a bold pawn storm, white seeks to pry open the kingside before black's queenside counterplay can materialize. This aggressive advance forces a critical decision regarding the central dark squares and promises a sharp tactical struggle. Black immediately challenges the bishop on b3, creating a dynamic tension and forcing white to reevaluate the safety of that piece. This maneuver also opens a diagonal for the c8 rook, potentially activating it down the c-file. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white initiates a decisive attack by sacrificing material to pry open the defenses. Opening up lines of attack across the kingside for white after the exchange of pawns creates a fascinating imbalance, forcing black to immediately consider how best to utilize the opened h-file for defense or counterplay while simultaneously contending with white's, potentially menacing bishop on c4 and the queen poised on d3. A daring bishop sacrifice is unveiled, creating a dangerous, albeit temporary, open diagonal aimed directly at black's king, aiming to disrupt the pawn shield and exploit the exposed monarch. Opening a path for the king's knight, this cautious maneuver aims to reposition it for future defensive duties, potentially shoring up the kingside's exposed structure. Launching a pawn offensive on the kingside, white aims to rip open lines and exploit the now somewhat exposed black king. The initiative shifts as white aggressively seeks to create weaknesses. Black seizes the initiative by challenging white's central pawn structure, forcing a confrontation that could lead to significant pawn exchanges and an opening of lines towards white's king. This aggressive pawn thrust introduces immediate tactical possibilities and aims to disrupt white's coordinated development on the king side. Opening up lines with the pawn storm has created a dynamic position, and the knight's leap to f5 is a bold probe, seeking to exploit the tension around black's kingside and disrupt its defensive harmony. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside has reached its natural conclusion, and now the focus shifts to material exchange and the resulting structural changes. By capturing the knight, black immediately addresses the most active white piece, preventing further incursings and opening up the g-file for potential counterplay. This trade, though it offers white the bishop pair, simplifies the position and allows black to solidify their defenses while seeking opportunities to exploit white's slightly overextended king. The long-term implications of this exchange will hinge on black's ability to activate their remaining pieces and coordinate an attack against white's king, which, while seemingly safe, could become a target if the queenside play stalls. Unleashing the f-pawn opens a critical diagonal for the queen and potentially a kingside attack, but it also creates weaknesses. The immediate aftermath of this pawn push will dramatically alter the pawn structure, leading to a more dynamic but inherently riskier middle game where white's initiative is paramount. Audacious sacrifice. Black gambits a knight, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially open lines against the uncastled king, but at what cost to piece activity and material balance? This aggressive thrust certainly injects immediate drama, forcing white into a complex tactical calculation where vigilance is paramount to avoid a swift positional collapse. Securing the pawn immediately prioritizes material, but at the cost of leaving your monarch exposed and potentially creating long-term weaknesses on the queenside. Opening the door to a potential king's side demolition, this pawn push thrusts itself into the heart of white's defenses, creating immediate complications. Initiating an exchange to simplify the position and clarify the shattered kingside structure, a logical consequence of black's daring pawn push. The immediate outcome is a more open diagonal for your rook, eyeing potential weaknesses, and a slight reduction in material that favors white's currently safer king. However, consider the long-term ramifications. Black's central pawn now becomes a significant outpost, potentially disrupting white's control over key squares. This sacrifice of your bishop, while seemingly tactical, might also be a positional concession, trading dynamism for a more controlled, albeit less ambitious, endgame. Think about how this maneuver impacts the mobility of your remaining pieces, and whether the gained initiative outweighs the lost bishop's influence. Relocating the king to g7, a seemingly passive retreat, is actually a smart decision to escape the immediate e-file pressure and consolidate black's somewhat precarious position. The capture on g7 has opened lines that could become dangerous for the black king if it remained on f8 or f7, and this maneuver places it on a more defensible square behind a pawn wall, while also freeing up the f8 square for a rook to potentially participate in the defense. The king's shield crumbles as white's knight boldly penetrates the weakened queenside, creating a potent threat against the beleaguered black monarch. This audacious foray exploits the open h-file, aiming to dismantle black's defenses with surgical precision and potentially unraveling the pawn structure around the king.